The hum of the engines filled the cabin like a steady heartbeat, masking the quiet tension that was already building. Long before the flight even left the ground, Flight 762 from New York to London had just begun boarding, and the air in first class smelled faintly of champagne and polished leather. Everything looked perfect, and at least on the surface. But behind that veil of luxury, something ugly was about to unfold. Dr. Amara Lewis stood near her assigned seat, a tall, poised woman in her mid-30s with calm eyes that carried both confidence and compassion. Her navy blue travel dress complemented her smooth skin and radiated a quiet elegance that made her stand out effortlessly. She wasn't just another passenger. She was a world-renowned neurosurgeon, flying to London to deliver a keynote speech at a medical conference. Her hands had saved countless lives. She was used to respect not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it through years of relentless dedication. But to flight attendant Karen Whitmore, none of that mattered. Karen had been flying with Royal Sky Airlines for over 20 years. Her smile was as practiced as the safety demonstration, but beneath it lay a deep resentment, a sense of superiority that no uniform could hide. When she saw Amara taking her seat in first class, Karen's eyes narrowed just slightly, an expression she thought no one noticed. Amara smiled politely and placed her medical briefcase in the overhead bin. "Good morning," she said gently. Karen's lips curved upward, but her tone was coated with ice. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right section?" "This is first class." The words sliced through the calm like turbulence. A few nearby passengers glanced up, sensing the tension. Amara straightened her posture, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, I'm quite sure. Seat 2A, right here." She held out her ticket. Karen didn't look at it. Instead, she glanced over Amara's attire, then back at her face. "Of course," she said finally, forcing a laugh. "Just making sure." Amara gave a courteous nod, but the sting of that moment lingered. She'd faced this kind of subtle insult before, in airports, hospitals, boardrooms. She had learned to let it slide, but today, something inside her whispered that this encounter wouldn't end quietly. As passengers settled, Karen made her rounds, offering drinks with a brightness that seemed just a bit too performative. Yet, whenever she passed Amara's seat, her eyes hardened. It wasn't long before the first real confrontation began. Amara had ordered sparkling water, but when Karen returned, she placed a glass of white wine on the tray instead. "Excuse me," Amara said politely. "I ordered water." Karen tilted her head. "Oh, did you? I must have misheard." "It's all right," Amara said, smiling faintly. "Could I just get the water, please?" Karen took the glass, muttering under her breath. Some people are never satisfied. That whisper wasn't as quiet as she thought. The man seated across the aisle, a middle-aged executive, raised an eyebrow. Amara decided to let it go again. She had more important things to think about, like her upcoming speech on saving lives, not clashing with flight attendants. But fate had other plans. Halfway through the flight, a small commotion erupted near the galley. Karen was whispering to another crew member, gesturing toward Amara. "She's been giving me attitude since boarding," Karen hissed. "I've had enough of these entitled passengers who think they can do whatever they want." "Karen," the other attendant whispered, "just let it go." "You're overreacting." But Karen's pride wouldn't let it go. Moments later, she stormed back into the cabin just as Amara stood up to stretch. "Ma'am, please sit down," Karen ordered sharply. Amara turned, startled. "I'm just stretching my legs." Karen's voice grew louder. "Passengers aren't allowed to stand in the aisle during turbulence." Amara frowned. "The seatbelt sign is off." The tension was now thick enough to choke the air. Every eye in first class turned toward them. Karen stepped closer, her face flushed with anger. "Sit down now," she shouted, grabbing Amara's arm. "Let go of me," Amara said, her voice low but steady. And then it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin as Karen's hand struck Amara's cheek. The entire cabin froze. Gasps erupted, a glass of champagne slipped from someone's hand and shattered. For a heartbeat, even the engines seemed silent. Amara stood motionless, her hand rising slowly to her face. The room spun, not from pain, but disbelief. She had endured insults before, but never violence, not in a place like this. Karen's face instantly shifted from rage to horror. She hadn't meant for it to go that far. But before she could stammer an apology, a commanding voice cut through the silence. "What in the world is going on here?" Heads turned as a tall man in an impeccable charcoal suit stepped out from the cockpit area. His presence alone changed the air. confident, composed and exuding quiet power. His eyes locked onto the scene, Karen trembling. Amara standing with quiet dignity, a red mark blooming on her cheek. "Sir, Karen began, but her voice faltered when she saw his face clearly. Her heart nearly stopped. "Mr. Lewis," she whispered. The passengers looked between them in confusion. Mr. Lewis. The name matched the airlines, Lewis Air Holdings, the conglomerate that owned Royal Sky Airlines. "Yes," the man said coldly. "I'm Jonathan Lewis, the owner." Karen's knees nearly gave out. She looked between him and Amara, horror dawning across her face. Jonathan walked up to Amara slowly, his eyes filled with concern. "Amara," he said softly, "are you all right?" The crowd gasped again. Amara nodded gently, tears forming but not falling. "I'm fine," she whispered. Karen's mouth fell open. "Amara, as in Dr. Amara Lewis?" Jonathan turned toward her, his expression darkening with every heartbeat. "Yes," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "My wife." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Silence spread across the cabin as every passenger tried to process what they had just witnessed, the arrogance, the cruelty, the stunning revelation. Karen's body trembled as the full weight of her actions hit her. She hadn't just insulted a passenger. She had assaulted the owner's wife, a world-renowned doctor who had saved hundreds of lives. And now, as Jonathan's eyes fixed on her with a calm fury that was worse than shouting, Karen knew her entire career, her reputation, and her freedom were about to crash harder than any plane ever could. Jonathan slowly raised a hand toward the nearest attendant. "Take her to the back," he said evenly. "This flight will continue under my supervision." Karen tried to speak, but no sound came out. The other crew member gently took her by the arm, leading her away as whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. Amara sat back down, still shaken. Jonathan knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You don't have to say a word," he said softly. Everyone saw what happened. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, the sting on her cheek slowly fading, replaced by the comfort of his presence. But deep down she knew this wasn't the end. The world would soon hear about what happened on Flight 2, and when they did, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a reckoning. Because some slaps don't just bruise the skin, they wake the world. The cabin of Flight 762 remained frozen in a kind of suspended disbelief. The slap still echoed in the minds of every passenger, bouncing between shock and outrage. No one spoke above a whisper, and even the flight attendants moving through the aisles now walked like they were stepping over broken glass. The woman who once commanded the aisle with arrogance, Karen Whitmore, now sat in the jump seat at the back, hands trembling, eyes staring blankly at the floor. The adrenaline that once fed her anger was gone, replaced by fear, regret, and the dawning realization that she had just destroyed her career with one impulsive act. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Amara Lewis sat in silence, her cheek faintly bruised but her posture composed. There was no trace of revenge or hatred in her eyes, only disappointment. She had faced humiliation before, but something about this moment felt heavier. It wasn't just personal. It was symbolic of every unspoken prejudice that followed her through her life. No matter how high she climbed, the irony of it all wasn't lost on her. Even 30,000 feet above the earth, she couldn't escape being judged by the color of her skin. Jonathan Lewis, her husband and the owner of Royal Sky Airlines, stood quietly beside her. His presence carried weight, not because of his wealth or title, but because of his control. Every glance, every breath he took spoke of someone used to command. But today command was mixed with fury he had to fight to contain. He had seen power abused before, but never this close to home. The captain's voice finally came through the intercom, his tone uneasy but composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to assure you that the situation has been handled. We apologize for any disturbance earlier. We'll be continuing our journey to London shortly." But the passengers knew that nothing about this flight would ever be ordinary again. One of the men in first class, the same one who had recorded the incident on his phone, approached Jonathan quietly. "Sir, I think people deserve to know the truth," he said softly. Jonathan looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Not now," he said, "but soon. The truth always finds its way." He turned back to Amara, taking her hand gently. "Do you want me to have the plane turned around?" he asked. "We can land right now if you need to." Amara shook her head. "No," she said calmly. "I'm not running from this. I have a speech to give in London. Let's finish the flight. Jonathan admired her strength. The same strength that had carried her through 12 years of medical school, endless hospital shifts, and every invisible battle she'd ever fought. But this time he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Hours later, when the plane finally touched down at Heathrow, the tension still lingered. As the doors opened, Karen was escorted out first, her head bowed, flanked by airport security. The sight was pitiful, a once proud woman now reduced to trembling silence. Jonathan had already made calls mid-flight, and the company's legal team was waiting at the gate. But Jonathan wasn't driven by vengeance. He was driven by justice. Outside, as Amara stepped into the terminal, surrounded by a quiet crowd of reporters who'd somehow caught wind of an incident, flashbulbs exploded. Journalists shouted questions, and most of which she ignored. But one question cut through the noise. "Dr. Lewis, is it true a flight attendant assaulted you because of your race?" Amara paused. She looked at the reporter, then at the cameras. Her voice, calm yet powerful, carried across the terminal. "I was struck because someone saw my skin before they saw my humanity," she said. "But I forgave her before we even landed, because hate is a heavy thing to carry, and I refused to let it fly with me." Her words hit like lightning. Within hours, they were on every news outlet, every trending hashtag. Our drummer Lewis and Flight 762, and Humanity First began to circulate globally. The story had gone viral. Back in New York, board members of Royal Sky Airlines gathered in an emergency meeting. Jonathan's face was calm but unreadable as the press flooded the company's phone lines. Some demanded accountability, others a statement. But Jonathan didn't want damage control, and he wanted reform. He stood up in the boardroom and said simply, "We built this airline to carry people, not prejudice. From this moment forward, every single employee, from executives to flight attendants, will undergo mandatory diversity, empathy, and human dignity training. Every passenger deserves respect, no exceptions." The room fell silent. No one dared argue. Meanwhile, Karen sat in a small, windowless office across town, waiting for a disciplinary hearing. Her lawyer sat beside her, silent. She knew what was coming. Termination lawsuits, public disgrace. But none of that hurt as much as the memory, the look in Amara's eyes after the slap. It wasn't anger she'd seen there. It was disappointment. Karen realized that for all her years of customer service, she'd never truly served anyone. Not with kindness, not with empathy. She had spent her life policing who belonged where, and now she was the one who didn't belong anywhere. 3 days later, Amara delivered her speech at the World Neurology Conference in London. The crowd stood and applauded before she even began. Her story had inspired millions, but she didn't speak about the slap, or the airline, or even herself. She spoke about humanity, how the brain processes fear, how prejudice is learned and unlearned, and how compassion literally rewires the human mind. Every act of kindness, she said, is a small surgery on the soul of the world, and every act of cruelty leaves a scar. But scars can heal, if we choose to learn from them. Her speech was broadcast worldwide. Hospitals, schools, and corporations invited her to speak about empathy and equality. Royal Sky Airlines, under Jonathan's leadership, launched a global campaign called "See the Human First." The slogan appeared on every aircraft, every boarding pass, and every training manual. The incident that could have destroyed the company instead became the spark that redefined it. Months later, as Amara boarded another flight, this time as an honored guest and a young flight attendant, approached her nervously. "Dr. Lewis," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. I joined this airline after the new program started. They taught us about empathy, about seeing people, not labels. You changed everything." Amara smiled warmly. "No," she said. "We all did. One choice at a time." As she took her seat by the window, Jonathan leaned over and whispered, "You still make the skies brighter even after the storms." Amara chuckled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Storms are just part of flying," she said. "It's how we handle them that defines the journey." Outside, the engines roared to life. The plane lifted into the open blue, carrying not just passengers but a new kind of awareness, one born from pain, transformed by grace and fueled by hope. And as the clouds parted, so did the world's heart, realizing that sometimes it takes a single act of cruelty to remind us all what true humanity really means. The end.